We're roughing up a perfectly good Conrail engine for a good reason, coming up right now on the main track.
Hey everyone, it's great to see you. Welcome aboard the main track. Well, you know, depending upon what railroad or era you model, things can either be nice and pretty or not exactly so much. Well, today in this episode, I'm going to show you how I created a rough and tumble piece of history for my layout. Take a look right here.
Well, the Katy was well known for its striking green and yellow locomotives, but there were also a lot of other colors running around the rails. In the early 1980s, the railroad leased a lot of blue Conrail units to help during a motive power shortage. The clips you're seeing right now are from the Clinton, Missouri area, and they come from our DVD, Katy's Country, from themaintrack.com. I have a link to that in the description. The Katy ended up purchasing a lot of these blue GP38s and GP40s. In what was supposed to be a temporary thing, these engines were patched out with MKT initials. Now, a lot of these units were repainted in the full green garb, but by the mid-1980s, merger talks were already on with the Missouri Pacific Union Pacific. And with that impending merger, the railroad didn't see a need in continuing to spend money on repainting these blue units. So they continued to soldier on in their Conrail patch-out paint jobs until the merger in 1988. For some rail fans, these adopted units weren't MKT enough. They kind of stood out like a blue eyesore, ruining the visual appeal of the green and yellow consists. Like I've said before though, she wasn't always pretty, but it was the Katy. I figured it was about time to have some of these units on the layout. For this project, I had to go to the only source of Conrail GP38s and GP40s in HO scale, and that's Atlas. Both of these models were produced years ago, and you've got to look pretty hard to find them, but they are out there. Well, a big reason I decided to finally tackle this project was Circus City Decals. Well, the company recently came out with these Katy Conrail patch-out graphics. I'm certainly not the best when it comes to using a paintbrush, but these decals make the job so much easier and nicer than I could ever pull off. The decals include pre-numbered sets representing each unit on the roster, so there's no cutting and setting individual numbers, thankfully. For the GP40, I need to remove the Conrail numbers. Now, at first, I figured I would just put the patch decals right over the original markings. But then I figured out the Atlas lettering is pretty thick and would actually end up showing through. So they need to come off first. These old Atlas markings don't come off very easily. To start off with this, I used Walther's Solvaset, or you can also use Microscale's Microsol. Both of these products are very similar with the same end result. This part includes some time and patience. Apply the liquid onto the spot you want to take off and let it sit for about 20 to 30 minutes, and you'll likely need to apply it several times. I've heard of some modelers using a paper towel soaked in Solvaset placed over the spot. Well, I tried that route but didn't have very much luck with this thick Atlas printing. Whatever you do, don't use alcohol. That'll actually start to take off some of the underlying paint. And how I learned that hard lesson is a story for another time. Well, after soaking for that 20 or 30 minutes, I started to gently rub it with a Q-tip, and the lettering slowly starts to come off. The one thing we will be leaving in place is the big Conrail can opener logo. Now for this locomotive, I'm leaving the Conrail lettering as well to represent one of the units, number 237, where the letters ended up showing through the patch outs and were almost fully visible. On the GP38 I modeled, the Conrail letters needed to be patched out, and I'll show you how I did that part later on. Next up for my GP40, I'm going to cut the Circus City decals out for the side patch with the new Katy numbers. I'll put it in place and let it dry for a while, and then put a coat of Microsol to soften it up and get it nice and snug. And then it's the same process for the MKT lettering patch on the long hood. Now, one of the things that was a little frustrating was discovering the Conrail lettering on the front and back of these GP40s is too big. Well, this wasn't something I ever would have noticed had I not taken on this project and been staring at photos for hours on end, but once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. Interestingly, the GP38s, which were released by Atlas at a later date, had the correct size of font. Now, to fix this issue on the GP40s, I'll remove the painted lettering like we did for the other markings, and then I'll have to order some new Conrail nose decals. Aside from that last step, this is what we have so far. Now, as for the GP38s, it's pretty much the same process, but there are some minor differences. The main thing is that the 38s had small white numbers on the cab as opposed to the big green patch-outs. For the patch-outs for the Conrail letters, I'm using Microscale's Conrail Blue trim film. As you can see in the prototype photos, those patch-outs were a blue color, but a few shades lighter than the rest of the original Conrail paint. Some of the units had patch-outs that were more of a gray color, and I've even seen some brown. Modeling one of those units will require another solution. Cutting the patch-outs for the long hood requires some measuring first and being very careful to get the cut straight. One thing didn't go quite as planned, unfortunately. The blue patch-outs from that Microscale trim film were a slightly different shade of blue, just like the prototype, and it looked good. But once I weathered the engine, the colors ended up matching, and I didn't get that standout effect. It doesn't look bad per se, just not the exact look I was going for. I'll likely go back soon and experiment with some other shades of blue. For the GP38s and GP40s, we need to cover up the black number boards with the white and apply those decals. The locomotives' handrails were painted white by Conrail, but once Katie got them, they painted them yellow. Now for this, I used some C&W yellow by Polyscale. Now that product has been discontinued, but other manufacturers make the same color. One of the last steps includes putting the sunshades back on the cabs. I do plan on going back pretty soon and installing strobe beacon lights on the top of the cabs and some other details. And then, of course, one of the very last steps would be weathering these locomotives up to make them look like they've been working hard out there on the Katy. Side by side here, you can see the GP38 with some weathering I put on compared to the GP40, which I have yet to dirty up.
I'd love to hear from you guys about a project maybe you undertook where you had to modify or patch things up on your locomotive or your rolling stock. Leave a comment down below, and we'll see you next time right here on the Main Track.